The Galactic Council heard the screams, then realized they were theirs. The first thing they did when they brought me into the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was make me stand on a small circular platform, maybe 2 meters wide, in the center of a room that could have swallowed 20 football stadiums whole. The ceiling was so far above my head that clouds formed up there, actual clouds, thin and gray, drifting between the upper gallery seats where thousands of alien representatives sat looking down at me. And I mean that literally, looking down at me. Every single species in that hall had positioned themselves at a higher elevation than the platform where I stood. They had built that into the architecture on purpose. My name is Caleb Hart. I was 31 years old when the Galactic Council selected me as humanity's first formal representative to their grand exposition of emerging species. I had a doctorate in xenolinguistics, 2 years of preparation, and a very nice suit that the Council's protocol office had deemed acceptable for a Class 3 emergent. The classification meant roughly what it sounds like. We were interesting enough to observe, not interesting enough to take seriously. I had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. I had studied every piece of alien footage humanity possessed. I had practiced the 22 formal gestures of galactic greeting. I had memorized species names, titles, political histories, territorial boundaries, alliance structures. I had not slept more than 5 hours a night in 4 months. And standing on that platform, looking up at the galleries of beings who had traveled across the stars to watch me like I was an exhibit at a zoo, I realized that none of that preparation had truly gotten me ready for how small they intended to make me feel. The Grand Exposition happened every 30 years. Its purpose was to formally introduce newly discovered or newly eligible species to the galactic community. There were 3 of us that cycle. A silicon-based collective from the Reth Arm, who communicated through vibrations in crystalline structures and had been traveling the stars for 200 years. A deep ocean species called the Pelhari Secundus, who experienced time approximately 4 times slower than most species and had achieved interstellar travel by the exercise of sheer patience over millennia. And then there was me. The Reth Collective went first. Their representative, a cluster of 17 interconnected crystals arranged into a rough humanoid shape, made sounds that translated into a 12-minute address about the nature of consciousness and collective identity. The galleries applauded with whatever limbs they had available. The Pelhari Secundus sent a representative who spent 22 minutes standing completely still. Their species considered movement during formal address to be aggressively impolite. The translator eventually clarified that the stillness itself was the address, that remaining motionless in the presence of others was their highest form of greeting and respect. The galleries applauded again. Then the platform rotated, and I was facing the main speaker's podium directly. Standing at the podium was Ambassador Scorethvel of the Vreth Dominion. The Vreth were tall, gray-skinned, and moved with the kind of deliberate slowness that old power has. They had been members of the Galactic Council for 900 years. They had absorbed, displaced, or outlasted 43 other civilizations in that time. They did not consider any of this remarkable. It was simply what dominant species did. Scorethvel looked at me for a long moment. Then he tilted his head and said, in perfectly translated Standard, "You are smaller than expected." I said, "Most things that matter are." There was a pause, not laughter exactly, more like the sound of a very large room deciding whether something was worth noticing. Scorethvel smiled with half his face, which was apparently a Vreth expression meaning something between pity and amusement. "Tell me," he said, "what does it feel like, as a representative of your species, to stand here knowing that your window is likely closing, that the pressures of interstellar politics, resource competition, and territorial expansion by more established civilizations tend to have a certain inevitable effect on Class 3 species?" He was asking me, politely and publicly, how it felt to know we were probably going to be erased. The entire hall was watching me. Tens of thousands of alien beings, every species with more history and power and technology than we had, all watching to see what the human would do. I looked at Scorethvel for a moment. I thought about my grandmother, who had been 8 years old when the first contact signal arrived from deep space, who had stood in her parents' kitchen in a small town in northern England and heard the news on the radio and cried from pure joy. She had lived her entire life believing that first contact would be the beginning of something wonderful. She had died at 92, still believing it, because she never had to find out what the something turned out to be. I smiled at Scorethvel, not a polite smile, a real one. "I don't answer hypotheticals," I said. He blinked both sets of eyelids, which meant he was surprised. I had done my homework. The session moved on. There were formal presentations, biological surveys read aloud by council scientists, projected charts showing humanity's technological development curve, life expectancy data, estimated resource consumption at current growth rates, projected interstellar capability timelines. They talked about us in the third person the entire time, even while I was standing in the room. Toward the end of the session, a massive display filled the air above the central platform. It was a visualization of predicted species lifespans, presented in colored bars of varying length. The Vreth bar stretched so far to the right it disappeared off the edge of the display. The Yiel conclave, the oldest member species, had a bar that went off both edges. And then there was humanity's bar, short, modest, stopping at a point that made several gallery members emit sounds their translators rendered as gentle laughter. I looked at that bar for a long time. Scorethvel caught my eye from the podium and gave me that same half-smile. I looked back at the bar. I thought about something my grandmother used to say, usually while she was doing something the doctors had told her not to do. She would say that the thing about humans was that they had never once in their entire history been told that something was impossible and simply accepted it. She was right about that. I did not say anything. I just stood there and looked at our short bar on their display, and I thought about the fact that bars can be drawn in two directions. And then the session ended, and they led me politely off the platform and back to the observer wing, where I would spend the next 4 days watching the rest of the exposition from a seat that was technically inside the hall but positioned so that a structural column partially blocked my view. They had not done that by accident either. I sat behind that column and I watched and I took notes and I smiled at no one in particular, because I was thinking about my grandmother and about directions, and about what it means to be underestimated by people who have never once in 900 years had a reason to reconsider their assumptions. I was still smiling when the transport came to take me back to the human embassy ship. The pilot, a young woman from council-affiliated neutral space named Dove, asked me how the exposition had gone. "Exactly as expected," I said. She nodded like that was a good thing. It was, just not for the reasons she assumed. 2 years later, I was crouched in a basement on Kepler 452b, pressing my back against a wall that was shaking hard enough to make my teeth click together, listening to the sky come apart. The Vreth Dominion called it a sanitation protocol. That was the official designation filed with the Galactic Council, transmitted on open channels so every species with a receiver could read it. Sanitation Protocol 7 Gamma. Not a war, not an invasion, a cleaning. The paperwork was immaculate. I had been on Kepler 452b for 6 weeks as part of a diplomatic observation rotation. The colony had 40,000 people, farmers mostly and engineers, and a medical research team studying atmospheric chemistry. Good people, ordinary people, people who had come to a difficult planet at the edge of explored space because they believed in building something that would last. The protocol began at 3:40 local time. No warning, no declaration, no ultimatum. One moment the sky was dark and full of stars, and the next moment the stars were moving, and then they were not stars at all, and then the sound arrived. I cannot describe that sound accurately. I have tried. The closest I can get is to say that it sounded like the air itself was being torn in a straight line from one edge of the world to the other. And then it sounded like that repeatedly because there was not one strike. There were hundreds. I survived because the basement I was in had been built by a structural engineer named Phil Greaves who had overcalculated every load-bearing wall by a factor of 3 because he had a fear of basements collapsing. I thought about Phil Greaves a lot in those first hours. I did not know his name at the time. I learned it later. I made sure to learn it. There were 40,000 people on that colony. I made sure to learn all the names I could. The first rescue contact came 11 hours after the initial strike. It was not a military ship. It was a cargo hauler named the Steadfast Run, civilian registration, whose captain, a woman called Nora Aldis, had broken 3 different navigation protocols to get to us faster. She brought medical supplies, emergency rations, and 22 volunteers who had heard the emergency broadcast and come anyway. Nora Aldis was 54 years old and had 7 kids, and she came into a system. The Vreth Dominion had just declared a sanitation zone without asking anyone's permission. I remember standing in the rubble of what had been the colony's main square and watching her ship come down through the smoke, and thinking that I had never in my life seen something so beautiful. The Galactic Council's response arrived approximately 60 hours after the strike. It was a formal statement expressing concern and requesting that all parties exercise restraint. The Vreth Dominion acknowledged receipt and filed no response. The Council passed a resolution noting the incident. The resolution had no binding authority and no enforcement mechanism, and the Council members who voted for it knew both of those things when they voted. I sent a full report to the diplomatic office on Earth. I included everything. The timeline, the methodology, the civilian composition of the colony, the Council's response, the timeline of the Council's response. I included Phil Greaves's name and what his walls had done. I included Nora Aldis's name and what her ship had done. I included the names of the volunteers. Earth's response came back in 8 hours. It was a single line from Director Owen Hale of the Office of Interstellar Affairs. It said, "We know, we are handling it." I did not know what that meant at the time. I would understand it later. The Vreth Dominion conducted 4 more sanitation protocols in the following 2 months. Not all of them were human colonies. One was a small outpost maintained by a neutral species called the Sethmieri, who had the misfortune of having set up their research station on a moon the Vreth had decided they needed. The Sethmieri were a gentle species. They had never fought anyone. Their entire philosophical tradition was built around the idea that conflict was a symptom of insufficient understanding. They had been trying to make friends with the Vreth for 60 years. None of that helped them. I watched the council session where the Sethmieri incident was discussed. I sat in the observer gallery this time, behind the same structural column as before, and I watched the council representatives argue about jurisdiction and precedent, and the specific legal definitions of territorial aggression. The Vreth Dominion's legal team was very good. They found 17 separate procedural objections to the proposed censure motion. The censure motion failed on a technicality related to how the original territorial boundary had been filed in the council archive. Somewhere during that session, sitting behind that column and watching the procedural failure of the galaxy's most powerful governing body in real time, something shifted in me. Not anger exactly, something quieter than anger, something that had edges. I filed for an emergency communication window with Earth that evening. Director Hale answered personally, which told me something. "I want to know what handling it means," I said. Hale was a compact man, gray-haired, with the kind of face that looked like it had decided a long time ago not to show anything it did not intend to show. He looked at me through the screen for a moment. "It means we are not going through the council," he said. "What are we going through?" "Ourselves," he said. That was the conversation. He closed the channel. I sat in the small room the council had assigned me as an observer quarters and looked at the wall and thought about what that word meant, coming from Owen Hale, coming at this particular moment, in this particular context. It meant we had already started. I did not find out the details until later, but in the weeks after that conversation, I began to notice things. Small things, the kind that would not mean anything individually but began to add up if you were paying attention in the right way. Supply manifests from human space that did not quite match the declared cargo. Personnel transfers to positions that had no obvious function. Shipping routes that ran through areas with no settlements and therefore no reason for a shipping route. The Vreth continued their protocols. They hit 2 more human outposts, both small, both remote, both chosen with the careful logic of a species that had done this before and knew how to select targets that would not generate enough sympathy to matter. They were very good at this. They had had 900 years to get good at it. Each time they hit something, Earth issued a formal protest. The protests were precise and detailed and completely ignored. The Council noted each one and filed them. The filing system was impressive. Nothing useful came out of it. Commander Nadia Holt was the first military officer I spoke to during this period. She found me in a council observation lounge and sat down next to me without introducing herself and said, quietly, "Stop trying to read the shipping manifests. You're not cleared for what they're moving." I looked at her. Should I be worried? About us? She shook her head slightly. No, about being in the wrong part of space when this turns, yes. When it turns, I said. When, she said, not if. She was very clear about that. She stood up and left. I did not see her again for many months. The second time a transport from Earth's primary shipyard sector passed through council-neutral space with a cargo listing of agricultural equipment. I sat in my room and looked at the stars outside my porthole and thought about Nora Aldis and her volunteers and Phil Greaves and his walls, and about all the names I was still carrying, and about the word when instead of if. Human beings have a concept that does not translate well into most alien languages. The Council's translation systems typically render it as something like extended determination, or the continuation of effort despite discouraging circumstances. But that rendering misses something essential. The actual word is stubbornness. And it is not a quality we developed because things were easy. We developed it because they were not. Every single generation of humans that ever lived faced something that should have stopped them. Disease, starvation, ice ages, wars that consumed continents. We faced every single one of those things, and we are still here, standing on other planets, staring at alien ceilings, taking notes, learning names, and waiting for the word when to become now. The Vreth Dominion understood force. They understood strategy. They understood the mathematics of territorial acquisition and resource competition and political leverage. What they did not understand, what they had never needed to understand in 900 years of dominance, was what a species with nothing left to lose looks like when it finally decides to stop asking permission. They were going to find out. The preparations were already finished. They had been finished for weeks. I did not know that yet, not exactly. But sitting in that observer lounge, watching the Vreth delegates' legal team file their 407th procedural objection, I felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Something enormous was already moving. It was moving quietly in the dark, without a single transmission, without a single broadcast, without a single word to the Council or anyone else. It was moving the way humans move when they are serious. Carefully, completely, with the kind of patience that only becomes possible when grief has burned away everything except clarity. I looked at the Vreth delegate across the chamber. He was reading something on a data tablet, relaxed, unhurried, the posture of a being who had never once been surprised by an outcome. I looked away. I did not want him to see my face yet. There would be time for that later. The silence started on a Tuesday. I know that sounds like a small detail. It is not. The day of the week matters because it tells you how it happened. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no final broadcast, no farewell address, no declaration. One Tuesday, human space was transmitting at its normal volume. News and data and commerce and personal messages and scientific telemetry and all the 1,000 daily frequencies of a civilization going about its life. And then Wednesday came and the frequencies were quiet. Not damaged, not interrupted, not degraded by interference or equipment failure. Quiet. Every single channel simultaneously with the precision of something that had been planned well in advance by people who were very good at planning. I was on Seth Prime when it happened. I had been on Seth Prime for 3 months at that point, maintaining a quiet diplomatic presence, attending council sessions, watching the procedural machinery grind through its endless cycles of discussion and non-action. My communication window with Earth had been normal the day before. Routine updates, status checks, the usual traffic. Then nothing. My first assumption was technical failure. My second assumption was that my personal equipment had malfunctioned. My third assumption, which arrived approximately 2 hours after the first, was that this was not a malfunction. Council communications were buzzing by mid-morning. Their monitoring systems had detected the shift in human transmission patterns, and because the council monitored everything and understood most of what they monitored, they were asking questions immediately. I sat in my observer quarters and let them ask. My communication system showed no connection errors. It showed a perfectly healthy link to the relay network. The relay network showed no traffic because there was no traffic to relay. I had received a briefing 3 weeks earlier. A single encrypted data packet delivered through a channel I had been given by Director Hale and had never used before that moment. The packet contained 18 seconds of audio, spoken by Commander Nadia Holt, and then it deleted itself. She had said, "Stay in position. Do not confirm or deny anything. The silence is intentional. When it breaks, it will not break quietly." That was all. So I sat in my observer quarters on Seth Prime and listened to the council scramble around me, and I said nothing, and I let them try to work it out for themselves. The first official interpretation came from the Vreth Dominion. They filed a council brief stating that the silence was consistent with the terminal collapse of communications infrastructure in a species experiencing significant internal destabilization. They did not use the word losing. They used the word transitioning, but they meant losing. Ambassador Skorethvel held a quiet gathering for Allied delegates that afternoon. I was not invited. I was told about it by a Pelhari Syndicate representative named Orson, who had attended and come to find me afterward looking thoughtful in a way that Pelhari expressed through a slight translucency in their outer membrane. Orson had figured out, from the combination of the timing and the scope and the absolute completeness of the silence, that something unusual was happening. "Your people have stopped talking," Orson said. "I noticed," I said. "All of them, every channel, at once." "Yes." Orson's membrane flickered. "That is not what collapse looks like," they said. "We have seen collapse. Collapse is loud. It becomes louder as it progresses. There is always more signal, not less, as a civilization faces difficulty. People transmit more when they are frightened." I said nothing. "What you have done," Orson said slowly, "is the opposite of that." I looked at them. Of all the beings I had dealt with on the council, I had always found the Pelhari the most perceptive. They experienced time differently, and that different experience gave them a kind of patience with observation that most species lacked. I am not in a position to comment on the internal communication status of human space, I said carefully. Orson was quiet for a moment, their membrane stabilized. "No," they said, "I suppose you are not." A pause. "Are you concerned?" "Not particularly," I said. They looked at me for a long time. Then they said very quietly, "I think I should be." The days passed. The Council's monitoring systems continued to show nothing from human space. The Vreth filed 3 more briefs, each one more confident in its assessment of human collapse than the last. The Yale Conclave issued a philosophical reflection on the tragic arc of species potential and the sorrows of evolutionary dead ends. The Council scheduled a formal session to begin the process of reclassifying humanity's status from emerging to ceased. I attended the session. I sat behind my column. I listened to the reclassification debate, which was thorough and well-argued and completely wrong about everything that mattered. The Vreth delegate made the opening address. He spoke for 40 minutes. He had charts. His charts showed the silence as a data set, mapped against historical patterns of species decline, and the pattern match was apparently quite compelling, because several council members who had previously been neutral began nodding at a rate that suggested genuine agreement. Scorathvel concluded by saying that it was always a difficult moment when a promising species failed to reach its potential, but that the Council's responsibility to accurate record-keeping required they update their classifications to reflect observable reality. He sat down. The Council chair opened the floor to responses. I stood up. The chair looked at me with the kind of expression that beings make when something they had not expected to move has moved. The observer representative does not hold speaking rights under standard session protocol, the chair said. The observer representative is also the formal diplomatic designate of a member candidate species, I said. Under Council Accord 17, Article 4, a member candidate representative retains speaking rights in any session where the status of their species is formally under consideration. I had found that article 8 months ago. I had been waiting for a reason to use it. The chair consulted their legal advisor. The legal advisor confirmed. The chair, with the expression of someone who had just noticed that the floor had more depth than expected, indicated that I could speak. I stood at the small secondary podium that the observer gallery used for procedural interjections. I looked at the chamber. Thousands of beings looked back at me. I have 2 questions, I said. The first is for the record. Has any council monitoring system observed direct evidence of human territorial loss, command failure, or military collapse? The chair consulted the monitoring report. No direct observational evidence has been presented. Thank you. My second question is a general one for the chamber. I paused. In the recorded history of the Galactic Council, has any species ever at any point chosen to go silent voluntarily? The chamber was quiet. There is a concept in human military history, I said. It is called communications blackout. It is not a sign of collapse. It is a sign of intent. You go silent when you do not want anyone to know what you are doing, where you are doing it, or when it will be finished. I looked across the chamber toward the Vreth delegation. I would like the record to note that I made this clarification before the session concluded. I sat down. The reclassification vote was postponed pending additional monitoring data. Orson found me in the corridor afterward. Their membrane was doing something I had not seen before, a rapid flickering that their translator rendered as the closest available equivalent to profound unease. What are they doing? Orson asked. I cannot comment, I said. Are they going to be all right? I thought about Nora Aldis. I thought about Phil Greaves. I thought about all the names I was carrying. I thought about Owen Hale saying we are handling it. I thought about Nadia Holt saying when. They are going to be exactly what they need to be, I said. Orson looked at me for a long moment. Then they nodded slowly and walked away. The silence continued. 3 days later, one of the Vreth Dominion's border scout ships returned early from its assigned patrol route. It docked at the Vreth diplomatic station on Seth Prime. Standard procedure would have had its crew file a report, take a rest cycle, and resume duties. Instead, within 4 hours of docking, the entire Vreth diplomatic mission on Seth Prime went into a communications lockdown of their own. I noted the time, I noted the date. Then I sat down in my room. And I looked at the stars and I waited because there was nothing else to do, and because humans are, when we need to be, extraordinarily patient. The silence from human space was now at 19 days. The council had stopped scheduling reclassification votes. The monitoring teams had tripled their scanning coverage. Nobody was finding anything. Because there was nothing to find, not where they were looking. The silence was not the absence of activity. The silence was the shape of activity. It was the sound of something enormous moving very quietly through the dark, and the fact that you could not hear it was not evidence that it was not there. It was evidence of how well it had learned to move. I turned off my light. I lay on the bed in my observer quarters on Seth Prime and looked at the dark ceiling and thought about my grandmother, and about all the people whose names I was carrying and about the word when, and I slept better than I had slept in 2 years. The silence was not defeat. It was the sound of us already having arrived. The first alert came in at 6:12 Council Standard Time, and the technician who received it assumed it was a sensor error. That was understandable. The alert was flagging 17 Vreth colony worlds as non-responsive simultaneously, and simultaneous failures at that scale do not happen, so the most rational explanation was that the sensor network itself had malfunctioned. The technician filed a maintenance request and went back to her regular monitoring work. 6 hours later, the maintenance team confirmed that the sensor network was functioning perfectly. The 17 worlds were still non-responsive. I was in the Council's public observation wing when the first emergency session was called. The call went out at 1340, designated priority amber, which in Council terminology meant significant but not yet critical. I walked from the observation wing to the public gallery of the main chamber, showed my credentials, and took my seat behind the column. The chamber was filling faster than I had ever seen it fill. Representatives were arriving, still adjusting their formal garments, their communication devices active, their aides talking rapidly into translation earpieces. The noise level was higher than normal. Not panic yet, something earlier than panic. The feeling of a room becoming aware that something has happened before it knows what. The council chair called the session to order at 14:07. The lead monitoring officer, a being called Arith So of the Yale Conclave, who had held the position for over 200 years, and who I had never once seen express visible emotion, stood at the main data podium and delivered the initial report in a voice that was measurably quieter than their normal speaking volume. 17 Vreth colony worlds. All communication ceased within a 4-hour window approximately 22 days ago, during the period corresponding to the ongoing human communications blackout. Initial Vreth military assessment had classified the communication loss as localized infrastructure damage, consistent with internal technical failure. The Vreth had not reported the situation to the Council because they had classified it as an internal matter. They had reported it now because the situation had expanded. While Arith So was speaking, a secondary alert arrived. 6 more Vreth worlds further into Dominion territory had stopped responding. The chamber sound rose. The chair called for order. Arith So continued. The 6 additional worlds had gone silent not simultaneously, but in sequence, over a period of approximately 31 hours. The sequence moved inward, toward the Vreth Dominion's core systems, following a pattern that the monitoring team's analytical systems described, after modeling, as consistent with deliberate progression. Another alert arrived while Arith So was still speaking. 12 more worlds. The chamber did not quiet this time when the chair called for order. I sat behind my column, and I looked at my hands, and I thought about Phil Greaves and his walls and Nora Aldis and her ship, and every single name I had collected since the first protocol. And I did not let my face show anything because this was not the moment and there would be a moment, and this was not it. Ambassador Skorathvel entered the chamber at 14:38. I had never seen him enter a room the way he entered it that day. Skorathvel moved slowly. He always moved slowly. It was a Vreth characteristic, and in his case it had always radiated a specific quality of ease, the slowness of a being who had nowhere urgent to be because he was already the most important presence in whatever room he occupied. He did not move that way now. He moved slowly because he was not moving the way he intended to move. He was moving the way a very large structure moves in the moment after something has gone wrong inside it, before the outside has caught up to the interior event. He sat in the Vreth delegation's primary seat, and he looked at the main display, which was now showing a map of Vreth space with the non-responsive worlds marked in a color the Council's display system defaulted to when it needed to flag something as requiring immediate attention. There were a lot of those markers. RSO finished their report. The floor opened for responses. 4 delegates began speaking simultaneously. The chair managed the chaos with the practiced efficiency of 2 centuries in the role. The Vreth legal team, to their credit, attempted a procedural response. They filed 3 motions in rapid succession, each one requesting different forms of emergency council intervention. 2 of the motions were accepted for review. The third was set aside because the specific intervention it requested required a resources commitment that the Council's charter did not authorize without a full membership vote. None of it mattered, and everyone in the room knew it. Then the message arrived. It came through on every Council-monitored frequency simultaneously. Every frequency. Not just diplomatic channels, not just emergency channels. Every single frequency the Council's network encompassed, civilian and military and scientific and commercial, all of them at once, the same message in the same moment. The display systems in the chamber shifted to show it automatically, because the broadcast was so comprehensive that the display systems had no other option. It was text, 23 words, no header, no signature, no timestamp. We are ready to discuss terms when you are. We will wait as long as necessary. We have time. 23 words, lowercase, no exclamation mark, no threats, no demands, no list of conditions, just a statement delivered with the calm of something that knows exactly where it stands and is not in a hurry. The chamber was completely still. I am not being dramatic when I say that. I mean it physically. Thousands of beings in that chamber, most of them species capable of remarkable levels of physical control and composure, and every single one of them stopped moving at the same moment. Even the translation system seemed to pause, as if the software itself needed a moment. Scorethvel did not move. Arithso of the Yale Conclave made a sound. Their translator rendered it as a single word, oh. That was the moment I understood something I had suspected for a long time. The Yale Conclave had been watching species rise and fall for thousands of years. They had seen empires built and civilizations end. They were old enough to have seen things that no living memory in that chamber could access. And hearing Arithso say oh in that particular tone, with that particular quality of recognition, I understood that they were not surprised by what had happened. They were surprised by who had done it. The Vreth delegation's secondary communications officer stood abruptly and left the chamber. Nobody stopped him. The door sealed behind him, and the sound of the door sealing was very loud in the silence that followed. The Pelhari Syndicate representative, a delegate named Foss who I had spoken with occasionally in the observation lounges, raised a formal point of information. The point of information was whether the Council had any confirmation of the specific nature of events in Vreth Dominion space. Arithso said that the monitoring teams had partial data from automated relay satellites in the affected regions, that the data was currently being analyzed, and that a preliminary summary would be available within the hour. Foss asked whether the word partial was being used in its technical sense, or as a diplomatic understatement. Arithso paused for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to answer the question without words. Foss sat back down and did not ask anything else. The preliminary data summary arrived in 43 minutes, which was 17 minutes faster than predicted, which told me something about how the monitoring team was feeling about what they were seeing. RSO read it aloud. Their voice was completely flat by the end, not because they were suppressing emotion, because the data itself was flat. Numbers and coordinates and timelines presented in sequence, each one individually comprehensible and collectively indicating something that required several minutes to fully process. The Vreth Dominion's forward military fleet, which had conducted the sanitation protocols, had been engaged simultaneously across 11 separate spatial coordinates. The engagement had not been a series of connected battles. It had been 11 independent, simultaneous operations, each one precisely targeted, each one completed in a timeframe that the Council's analytics team described as, and I am quoting the actual phrase they used, inconsistent with previously modeled human military capability. The word previously was doing a lot of work in that sentence. The Vreth Dominion's logistical infrastructure, the supply networks and communication relays and resource distribution systems that allowed their military to operate across interstellar distances, had been methodically compromised across the same period. Not in one strike, over time, layer by layer, the way you take apart something complex when you understand it completely and have decided to dismantle it with care rather than simply break it. The monitoring data showed the pattern clearly once you knew what you were looking at. It had been happening for months, small disruptions, individually insignificant, supply routes rerouted, relay stations going briefly offline and coming back, minor irregularities in the timing of resource shipments, each one explainable by ordinary causes, none of them in isolation alarming. In aggregate, over time, mapped against the final engagement data, they formed a picture of a campaign so thoroughly prepared that the actual visible action, the part that had happened in the 4-hour window of simultaneous engagement, was not the campaign itself. It was the conclusion of a campaign that had already been running invisibly for months. RSO finished reading, set down the data tablet. The chamber did not make a sound. Scorathvel had not moved since the message arrived. He was sitting in the Vreth delegation's primary seat and looking at the main display, where the map of Vreth space was now showing more non-responsive markers than responsive ones. The chair, after a long silence, said formally, "Does the Vreth Dominion delegation wish to respond to the information presented?" Scorathvel turned his head. He looked at the chair. He looked at the display. He looked at the 23 words still running across the bottom of the screen in their quiet lowercase certainty. He said nothing. He had nothing to say. Foss of the Pelhari Syndicate raised a hand. "I would like to request," Foss said, "that the Council formally note, for the record, the time and content of the human communication, and that the Council's response to that communication be classified as a matter of immediate priority." The chair said, "The chair recognizes the urgency of the matter." I stood up from behind my column. I did not go to the secondary podium. I stayed where I was, standing in the public gallery, and I waited until the chair acknowledged me. "The human diplomatic representative," the chair said, and the chamber turned to look at me. I had been carrying names for 2 years, 40,000 people from the first colony, names from every protocol after that. Phil Greaves and his walls, Nora Aldis and her volunteers, the Sethmiyiri on their moon. I had been carrying all of it, every session behind that column in silence. I had prepared a statement, 3 pages, formal language, carefully worded. I had written it 2 weeks ago in the expectation of this moment, and I had memorized it. And standing in that gallery with the chamber looking at me and Scorathvel's stillness in my peripheral vision, I set it aside completely. "Humanity is ready when you are," I said. "We have been ready for quite some time." I sat back down. Nobody called for order. Nobody needed to. The screaming had not started yet. but in the quality of the silence that filled that chamber, in the way thousands of beings sat completely still and looked at a display showing the wreckage of 900 years of assumptions. I heard what screaming sounds like the moment before it begins. It sounds exactly like that. The formal session convened at 900 Council Standard Time, 3 weeks after the chamber had last tried to hold a functional meeting and failed. I walked in with Commander Nadia Holt on my left and a woman named Grace Avery on my right. Grace Avery was 17 years old. She was from Kepler 452b. She had brown hair and a scar on her left jawline from the first night of the first protocol, and she walked into the grand hall of the Galactic Council with the posture of someone who had decided exactly how much space she was entitled to occupy, and was occupying precisely that much. The human delegation was 12 people total. I had argued for a larger group. Owen Hale had said 12 was enough. Looking at the chamber as we walked to the designated floor position, I understood what he meant. 12 people in that enormous space, surrounded by thousands of alien representatives, should have looked small. We did not look small. I'm not sure I can fully explain why. It was something about the way we moved, or about what the room knew about us by that point, or possibly both. The council chair opened the session with the standard formal invocation and then immediately departed from standard procedure by asking the human delegation to speak first. This was unprecedented. The chair did not explain the departure from protocol. Nobody asked. I had been told I would open. I had prepared remarks. I stood at the central floor position where, 3 years ago, I had stood on that small circular platform being examined by galleries full of amused beings, and I looked up at those same galleries, and I delivered the remarks I had prepared. I want to be careful about how I describe what I said, because the words I am about to share were not chosen for drama. They were chosen because they were accurate, and because accuracy, at that particular moment, was the most powerful thing available. I said that humanity had not sought this conflict. I said that humanity had attempted, through available channels, to address it without escalation. I said that those attempts had failed, and that the record of their failure was documented in the Council archive in considerable detail. I said that humanity had then addressed the conflict through other means, and that the results of those means were also available in the record. I said that we were not here to apologize for what we had done. We were here to determine what happened next. Commander Holt spoke second. She had a different quality than I did, a directness that came from a life spent making decisions in contexts where second thoughts were a luxury. She presented the operational timeline in clear language, not to boast, because it was relevant, because the Council needed to understand what had happened and why it had happened the way it had happened if they were going to understand what it meant for the future. The Vreth Dominion had struck first. Humanity had not struck back immediately. Humanity had taken the time to understand the problem completely before addressing it. This was not weakness. This was method, and the distinction mattered. She said something near the end of her remarks that I had not known she was going to say, because she had not told me in advance. She said that in every previous case where the Galactic Council had encountered an emerging species, and that species had faced pressure from an established power, the Council's approach had been to observe and record. She said that this was not, in itself, a malicious approach, but she said that it had, in practice, established a pattern that had served established powers very well. She said that pattern was now retired. The room was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Grace Avery spoke third. She had not prepared formal remarks in the Council sense. She stood at the central position and she was still for a moment, just standing there, looking up at the galleries the way I had looked up at them 3 years ago, and then she began to speak. She did not speak about strategy or timelines or the future of galactic politics. She spoke about the morning of the first protocol. She described what she remembered, what the sound was like, what the sky looked like, the specific order in which things happened. She was precise and she was calm and she did not raise her voice once. The translation systems worked in perfect silence. The chamber worked in perfect silence. Then she said she wanted to read some names. She looked down at a folded piece of paper she had been holding in her left hand the entire time. She read 43 names. Not the total from the colony, just 43. The 43 people in her immediate community, the people she had known personally, whose absence had been a specific shape in her days since. She read them without inflection. First name, surname, all 43. It took a little over 3 minutes. Then she folded the paper, put it back in her hand, looked up at the chamber and said, "You watched. Remember that. We do not forget and we do not expect you to either." She stepped back. I do not have a precise record of what the chamber sounded like at that moment because I was not focused on the chamber. I was looking at Ambassador HFY, who was seated in the Vreth delegation's primary position at the floor level, not elevated, because the Vreth had been formally redesignated to floor-level status pending the resolution of the session. He was looking at Grace Avery. He looked like a being who had spent 900 years believing a particular thing about the universe, and had just discovered that the universe did not share the belief. The chair called for a recess. 20 minutes. When the session resumed, the floor was opened for council-wide response. Orson of the Pelhari Syndicate spoke first. They said that the syndicate wished to open formal trade negotiations with humanity. The syndicate's interest was in a comprehensive partnership agreement, not a limited commercial arrangement. They wished this noted for the record. They wished humanity to know that the syndicate had consistently advocated for stronger council response to the sanitation protocols. I did not correct this characterization publicly. The record would do that on its own. The Yale Conclave elder spoke second. They were very old and they moved very slowly, and the chamber went still in the way it goes still when something that has seen more than anyone else in the room begins to speak. They said that they wished to formally retract the conclave's philosophical statement regarding humanity's potential. They said that the statement had been issued in error, based on an assessment that was incomplete. They said that the conclave had made similar errors in the past, and that the conclave's long history gave it no special immunity to misreading species that chose to develop in unexpected directions. Then they said something that I have thought about many times since. They said, "We have been here for 4,000 years. In that time, we have seen many things that seemed impossible until they happened. What we have never seen before in 4,000 years of observation is a species that translates grief directly into precision. We did not know that was possible. We know it now." They sat down. The Vreth Dominion's legal team attempted 3 separate procedural motions during the response period. All 3 were ruled out of order on different grounds. The 4th time their senior legal representative rose to speak. The chair said, very quietly, that the Dominion's procedural rights remained intact and that the council would hear from them in the designated response window, but that they would not be called upon ahead of that window, and that this was a courtesy rather than a requirement. The legal team sat down and did not rise again. Owen Hale had arrived by then. He sat in the rear of the human delegation and said nothing and needed to say nothing. He was the one who had told me we are handling it, and he was here to watch what handling it had produced, and his expression throughout the session was the expression of a person who is not surprised by an outcome, but is still, in some very deep and private way, moved by it. When the Dominion's designated response window arrived, Scorethvel himself stood to speak. Not a legal aide, not a communications officer, Scorethvel. He spoke for 11 minutes. The translation was precise, and I listened to every word. He said that the Dominion recognized the events that had occurred. He said that the Dominion was prepared to enter discussions regarding their obligations under council law, and that the Dominion's legal team would be available for those discussions at whatever schedule the council designated. He said this in a voice that had no particular quality to it, neither hostility nor remorse, just the flat precision of a being delivering information he had decided to deliver without additional content around it. At the end, he paused. He looked at Grace Avery, who was standing at the edge of the delegation position with her paper still in her hand. He said, "I understand that words at this juncture carry limited weight. I offer none beyond those required by process." He sat down. Grace looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away. She had already said what she needed to say. She was not going to say anything more than that, and she did not, and the dignity of that was its own kind of answer. The terms humanity had prepared were presented formally by Commander Holt in the second half of the session. I will summarize them here because the full document runs to several hundred pages, and most of it is procedural specification. We did not take territory. We did not take resources. We did not demand tribute or reparations in the conventional sense. What we demanded was reconstruction. Every colony world the protocols had damaged would be rebuilt, physically and materially, to at least the standard it had been before, funded and staffed by Vreth resources under human supervision, on a timeline we set, with progress reporting directly to the Council's Reconstruction Oversight Committee, which we were requesting be established as a permanent body. Additionally, humanity formally requested, not demanded, requested, that the Council create a new category of membership for emerging species, not observer status, not candidate status, full participation rights with a specific protection framework that would require Council action rather than Council non-action in the event of protocol-style events in the future. The distinction between action and non-action mattered. We had watched non-action function as a policy for long enough. The chair asked whether humanity intended to seek a seat on the Council itself. I answered that one. I said that humanity's immediate priority was reconstruction and structural reform, and that questions of direct Council membership would be addressed in future sessions, and that we appreciated the inquiry. The chair asked whether humanity had any comment on the broader implications of the events that had occurred for the Council's understanding of Class 3 emerging species and their classification criteria. Holt answered that one. She said that humanity had no objection to the Council reviewing and revising its classification criteria, and that we would be pleased to contribute to that review, and that we had some thoughts on the subject. She said that last part very quietly. It produced a particular kind of attentiveness in the chamber that I had not seen before. The session concluded at 1847 Council Standard Time, nearly 10 hours. The chair declared a recess pending formal submission and review of the terms presented. Standard timeline for review was 42 days. The chair noted that given the circumstances, the chair was exercising procedural authority to compress the review timeline to 14 days. As the chamber cleared, RSO of the Yale Conclave made their way across the floor toward our delegation. They moved slowly, the way the very old move when they are not in a hurry, and have decided that what they are approaching is worth the time it takes to get there. They stopped in front of me. They looked at me with the kind of attention that belongs to beings who have been paying attention for millennia. They said, "May I ask you something directly, without procedural framing?" I said yes. They said, "When your people went silent when the blackout began, were you certain? Did you know it would work?" I thought about Nadia Holt and the word when. I thought about Owen Hale and the word we. I thought about Phil Greaves and Nora Aldis and Grace Avery, and her 43 names and every name beyond that, and I thought about my grandmother hearing the news on a radio in a small kitchen in England, and crying from joy at the idea of not being alone in the universe. I said we were not certain, we were clear, there is a difference. RSO was quiet for a moment, then they said, "Yes, there is." They turned and walked back toward the Yale delegation. I walked out of the chamber with Commander Holt and Grace Avery. The corridor was long, and the lights were the cool blue-white of Council architecture, designed. I had always thought, to make organic beings feel pleasantly small. We walked through those lights and none of us felt small. Grace asked if she could have a moment. Holt and I stopped walking. Grace walked a few steps ahead to a window that looked out over the terrace levels of the council spire, which faced the night side of Seth Prime. You could see the stars from that window, a full field of them, the kind of view that designers of grand buildings put windows in specific places to frame. She stood at that window for maybe a minute, not doing anything, just looking. Then she turned around and walked back to us and said simply, "Okay, I'm ready." We walked out together through the main entrance of the council spire, where the light changed from blue-white to the warmer spectrum of Seth Prime's night sky, and the air smelled like something that was not quite Earth, but was close enough that it registered in some old, wordless part of the brain as familiar. I stopped there and looked up. The same stars I had looked at as a child, from a different angle now, from a different planet, in a different context entirely. The same stars my grandmother had heard about on a radio in a small kitchen and cried over. The stars I had stood beneath on Kepler 452b, while a cargo ship called the Steadfast Run came down through smoke and changed the definition of what showing up meant. I thought about all the names. Not the 43 Grace had read, but all of them, the full count, the weight I had been carrying for 2 years and would carry for the rest of my life. Because some weights are the kind you choose to keep because putting them down would mean forgetting what they taught you. What they taught me was this. The galaxy heard us scream. They did not help. They watched and recorded and filed reports and voted on resolutions, and for 2 years they were completely confident that the screaming was ours and that it would eventually stop because we would eventually stop. They were right that the screaming was ours. They were wrong about everything else. Because we did not stop. We got quiet, which is different, and we aimed the quiet, and when it finally broke in a direction nobody had expected because nobody had ever needed to look in that direction before. That is the thing about screams. The council heard them and assumed they knew what screams meant. They thought screams meant the end of something. Screams mean the beginning of something. That is what they always have meant. From the very first moment our very first ancestor opened their mouth in the dark and made a sound that said, "I am here, and I am not done yet." We were not done. We are still not done. We are just getting started. And now, for the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, everyone in that building behind me knows it too. I looked up at the stars for a long time. Then I turned around and went back to work. There was a great deal of work left to do, and humans have never been a species that leaves work undone. That, if nothing else, is one thing the Council can now say with absolute certainty that they know about us.